Welcome to Rochester, one of the most historic settlements in Kent, in the southeast of England. Boasting some 2,000 years of history, stretching all the way back to the early Roman era, Rochester is brimming with stories on every corner. And on this walk around the town centre on a gorgeous summer's day, we'll not only make sure to visit famous local landmarks, including the mighty Rochester Cathedral, the old city walls, and indeed the towering Rochester Castle, home to England's tallest medieval keep, but we'll also inspect the many more captivating points of interest to be found on Rochester's streets, from a historic green postbox to the 300-year-old French hospital, a stunning Elizabethan-era townhouse, the place where a king left England for the very last time, and indeed plenty of buildings which featured in the works of none other than Charles Dickens, a man who held a deep affection for Rochester throughout his life. All of that, and plenty more, is to come over the next 25 minutes or so. But we begin our walk taking in a picture postcard view of a handful of iconic Rochester landmarks. The castle looming large in the background, behind the eye-catching Chertsey's Gate, standing directly before us. Built over the course of more than 3 decades in the mid-14th century, this nearly 700-year-old gateway has witnessed firsthand the countless changes that have unfolded on the streets of Rochester. The High Street today bursting with colour, with gorgeous summer bunting draped between buildings young and old. On these central crossroads alone, we're surrounded on all sides by addresses with entire novels worth of history to tell. And speaking of which, this quaint white building is quite an important one in the world of literature. It's known to bookworms as Mr. Tope's house, and it featured in Charles Dickens' serialised novel of 1870, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Significantly, this was Dickens' last ever novel. He died with just 6 of a planned 12 instalments written, and the very last building that was mentioned in his writings was none other than Mr. Tope's house, here in Rochester. Dickens was originally born in Portsmouth, but as a child his family moved to the town of Chatham, less than a mile away from central Rochester. Therefore he was a regular along these streets, and with a vivid memory of his childhood in Kent here, he used a wide array of local landmarks in his later stories, as we'll see as we continue our walk today. However, set back from the busy high street here, we find a landmark like no other in this storied town. Rochester Cathedral, a majestic place of worship which by centuries predates all else that surrounds us. Though a grand edifice today, the cathedral has rather humble origins. It was founded more than 1400 years ago in 604 AD, during the earliest years of Christianity in England. 30 miles to the southeast of Rochester, there lies the city of Canterbury, the place where the missionary Augustine established the Christian faith in England. He became the very first Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 597, and soon the religion began to spread, with a cathedral founded here in Rochester. But for the first 4 centuries of its life, Rochester Cathedral was a much smaller structure than the behemoth we see today. Rebuilt and expanded over many centuries, the cathedral features architecture from countless different eras. Its oldest stonework of all found just here in what's known as Gundulf's Tower, an old bell tower that was likely built in the 12th century, and named for Gundulf, once the Bishop of Rochester. Indeed, as we pass through the 15th century Deanery Gate, the Bishop of Rochester is the second oldest such position in England, after only the understandably more well-known Archbishop of Canterbury. Even today, the Bishop of Rochester's seat is here at Rochester Cathedral, a building which has grown through history despite a number of setbacks. Most infamously, after William the Conqueror's invasion of 1066, this cathedral was brutally neglected by the newly installed Earl of Kent, decaying to the point of oblivion. It was the Bishop Gundulf who initiated the cathedral's restoration, and today it stands proud as Rochester's grandest place of worship. But it's not the only one that you'll find here in the centre of town. This is St Nicholas's Church, which was originally built just over 600 years ago in 1423. Now, the church that we see today is actually a rebuild of 1624, but the reason it was opened in the first place, directly beside the cathedral, was to settle a quarrel that had been brewing on the streets of Rochester for centuries. After Gundulf's restoration of the decaying building, Rochester Cathedral flourished as the church of a monastery, officially the Priory of St Andrew. This area of town then, within Chertsey's Gate, where we started our walk, was populated with monks dedicating themselves to their faith. But beyond the bounds of this area, there was also a growing civilian population, people who themselves desired a place to worship. Initially, locals were permitted to pray as a separate congregation at an altar within the cathedral, but eventually, in the 1420s, they were told that they could no longer do so, and so a new church was built right next door, especially for the townspeople. But this part of Rochester is so densely packed with history that we must briefly turn our attention away from the churches and to the castle, one of the mightiest castles that has ever stood in southern England. Established more than 900 years ago, in the late 11th century, Rochester Castle is an immense fortification, with a rich history that we'll discuss once we venture inside. But before we do, take note of a small group of gravestones here beneath the castle walls. This unassuming burial ground hosts a number of tombs for locals who died around the time of the mid-19th century, and it's been remarked that one Charles Dickens, who died in 1870, would have much preferred to have been buried in this small graveyard had he had the choice. In the end, he was laid to rest inside Westminster Abbey in London, though his lifelong affection for Rochester here is still plain to see as we explore the town's streets. Facing back across the street here, we're greeted with a mesmerising view of Rochester Cathedral's grand west front. This part of the cathedral is another of its oldest features, built in the mid-12th century, with a number of later additions, including the Great West Window up above, dating from 1470. But just down below here is the west front's most spectacular detail, the Great West Door, which features a sculpture carved nearly 900 years ago in 1150. Almost entirely unchanged since that time, it depicts carvings of dozens of beasts surrounding the doorway, a technique which was employed to scare demons away at the door of this sacred place. It's remarkable to think that such an intricate decoration has been in place for so long, almost since the time of Gundulf, the bishop who built far more than just the few landmarks we've mentioned. In the late 11th century, Gundulf was one of William the Conqueror's greatest architects. He was also responsible for building Colchester Castle and the famous White Tower at the heart of the Tower of London. And indeed, here in Rochester, he was the man who began construction on the stone castle that we see before us here. Now, in all truth, little of Gundulf's handiwork remains visible today, the exception being part of the west curtain wall on the other side of the fortress. But you'll likely forgive the bishop when you discover the countless ups and downs that this castle experienced in a very short period of time, when Rochester found itself caught up in a number of medieval England's defining conflicts. Situated in a strategically significant location, the castle overlooks the River Medway, crossed by a bridge that carries the historic road linking London and Canterbury. London, the seat of royal power in England, and Canterbury, the home of the church, were two of the country's largest and most important cities at the time, and in the late 12th century they found themselves at odds in the infamous dispute between King Henry II and the Archbishop Thomas Becket. In this feud over the rights of crown and church, Rochester Castle was held by the archbishops, albeit on the king's behalf. Despite the temperature of the conflict, though, this castle escaped unscathed, in no small part thanks to the immense defences which had been built just a few decades earlier. Standing before us here is the most famous part of Rochester Castle, the Keep. The central and most fiercely defended part of the fortress, this mighty stone structure was built around the year 1127, and at a height of more than 100 feet, it ranked as one of the tallest buildings in all of Europe for its day. Incredibly, the keep then looked almost exactly as the keep does now. It's one of the very best preserved castle keeps you'll find in the country, and it still ranks as the tallest of its kind in England. Indeed, if you visit Rochester today, you can venture up to the top of the keep, and take in the commanding views over the town and the river, which were once so strategically valuable. And you can also explore the building's interior. But it's no grand medieval palace. In fact, the building inside lies vacant, a shell of what was once one of the nation's most crucial fortresses. In the year 1215, the clash between Crown and Church exploded once again, and a major siege unfolded here at Rochester Castle, between the armies of the infamous King John and rebels seeking to restore the terms of the Magna Carta. Held by the Archbishop, capturing Rochester Castle was a major target for King John, and so he laid siege to this fortress for 2 months, burning the bridge over the river to cut the rebels off from reinforcements in London, and relentlessly bombarding those inside the keep. Eventually, starvation forced the rebels' surrender, and the king took the victory here, although he ultimately died just 1 year later, and never figured in the eventual conclusion of the war. But it wasn't this siege which led to the fortress's ruin. In fact, the keep was restored, and it was actually a siege of 1264 that ultimately led to Rochester Castle's decline. Many buildings destroyed that year were never rebuilt, and eventually, by the mid-16th century, this place had lost all value as a usable fort. All that despite its famously strategic position. Just here we can witness for ourselves that view over the River Medway, the bridge carrying the old London Road, on a site which has actually been in use for almost 2,000 years. This river, flowing for some 70 miles right across the width of Kent, empties into the Thames estuary just a short distance downstream from us here. And this, the lowest point of the river crossed by a bridge, is the very place where none other than the Romans built their own bridge, in the early stages of their conquest of Britain. Back in the year 43 AD, Roman armies landed on the island of Great Britain in the southeast of Kent, venturing up from the beaches near Richborough and pushing inland, through Canterbury and on towards the place where they would establish Londinium, or London as we know it today. On the way, they passed through this area, where they would cross the River Medway, and so a Roman settlement was founded here in Rochester, known in Latin as Durobrivae. As we now make our way out of the castle grounds by way of the Watergate, leading down towards the river, the Roman settlement of Durobrivae grew greatly during the occupation. This area was home to many Roman villas, and in the 3rd century, large walls were built around the settlement. Eventually, though, the Romans abandoned Durobrivae in the 5th century, along with the rest of Britannia. But Rochester, on the road to London, remained important for centuries to come. Just here, we're looking at a building known as the Bridge Chapel. It was built in the late 14th century as a place of shelter and worship for travellers and pilgrims journeying between London, Canterbury, and Dover. The road through Kent here was a major route of pilgrimage for those visiting Canterbury Cathedral, or indeed venturing towards the port of Dover and onto France and mainland Europe. And so the bridge that crosses the Medway here was for so long an integral piece keeping this part of England connected. Of course, this isn't the original Rochester Bridge, far from it. In fact, the river crossing that we see today is technically made up of 4 separate bridges. From left to right, this aerial view shows us the so-called Old Bridge, a road bridge built in 1914. Beside it is what's known as the Service Bridge, a narrow modern crossing that carries cables and pipes over the river. Next to that is the New Bridge, another road bridge dating from 1970, and then finally is the Railway Bridge of 1891. Indeed, as we take a glance at the rather splendid building that hosts the Castle Club, a 19th century gentleman's club for the playing of cards and billiards, if the presence of 4 separate bridges desperately clamouring to cross the same piece of river here isn't an indication of the importance of this crossing, then I don't know what is. Simply put, the bridges are an important part of Rochester's history. The river has been crossed here by structures built by all of the different cultures who've settled here through the millennia, and so it's only right that they feature on any tour of this riveting town. But leaving the bridges behind now, it's time for us to begin a walk along Rochester's delightful High Street, which stretches all the way from this point beside the Royal Crown pub, which dates back to the 18th century, to the other side of town, even beyond the bounds of the old city walls, which once protected Rochester on all sides. Now, we'll be visiting the remains of the city walls at the end of our walk, but as we make our way onto Rochester's main street, it's here that we'll be able to see the addresses that some of the most famous visitors to Rochester have frequented over the years. First up, on the right, there stands a huge hotel, a historic coaching inn named the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel. Its name gives us a clue as to its most famous guest. Princess Victoria stayed overnight here in 1836, just 1 year before she became Queen. Charles Dickens was also a regular guest, featuring the hotel in both Great Expectations and the Pickwick Papers, while the Bull part of the hotel's name comes from its original moniker. It was simply called the Bull Inn in the centuries before Victoria's stay, and provided food, drink and lodging to those travelling between London and Dover. Directly opposite the hotel, meanwhile, is one of the High Street's most beautiful landmarks, the Guildhall. Built all the way back in 1687, this storied municipal building once hosted markets on its ground floor, and court and council sessions inside, though today it plays host to a museum, showcasing local history and the town of Rochester's own art collection. It's well worth a visit if you're in town. The building is just as beautiful inside as it is out here. But even if you don't have time to step in the door, do take a moment to admire something rather unusual: a green postbox. Placed here back in the reign of Queen Victoria, this is actually one of Britain's oldest postboxes, dating back to a time when the country's famous pillar boxes were all painted green, before the iconic red colour scheme was devised to make them easier for people to spot on the street. Still in use today, the postbox is yet another riveting point of interest in this town. But that word, town, that's a funny one here in Rochester. The truth is that for the vast majority of its history, Rochester here was actually classified as a city. But by the 20th century, urban sprawl saw the city naturally merge into a conurbation with the neighbouring areas of Chatham, Rainham, Strood and Gillingham. Together, albeit initially without Gillingham, they joined together to create a new borough of Medway, named for the river, with the historic city of Rochester retaining its status within this new entity. But when the borders of Medway were expanded in 1998, what was dubbed as an administrative error on the part of the council actually led to Rochester here losing its city status, which was originally owed to the presence of a cathedral, but under modern rules wasn't naturally expanded to include all of Medway. This error seemingly went unnoticed for 4 years, when in 2002 the government's official list of cities seemed to be missing Rochester, and technically correctly, meaning that this place could no longer legally be called a city. Now there is much more to that story, but we sadly don't have time to get into all of its legal complexities, especially as we find ourselves here admiring the gorgeous facade of the old Corn Exchange. Originally built back in 1706, the Corn Exchange is most famous for its huge clock, added in 1771 and jutting out over the High Street. Charles Dickens himself featured this clock in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, describing it in his last novel as the moon-faced clock. Indeed, it nearly reaches all the way across the street towards the Jolly Knight, a small pub which stands directly next door to one of the High Street's oldest inns of all. The King's Head, situated on the crossroads where we started our walk, stands on a site which has been occupied by an inn for well over 400 years. The current building, largely made up of newer 18th and 19th century architecture, albeit with some older brickwork to be found around the back. Further along the street, meanwhile, is of course Chertsey's Gate, which, as we know, originally dates to the mid-14th century, having been built as a gate separating the monastery of the cathedral from the busy streets of medieval Rochester. Interestingly though, this gate has been known by many different names through time. As well as Chertsey's Gate, it's also been known as the College Gate, the Cemetery Gate, and in Charles Dickens' The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Jasper's Gate. I suppose you can take your pick on your favourite name for what is surely one of the town's most picturesque buildings, with Mr. Tope's house, originally built around 1550, nestled just beside. But let's continue making our way along the high street, because there's even more for us to see. In fact, just here we find a building known locally as Abdication House, a house which hosted a king at the very end of his reign. Back in 1688, King James II was deposed from the throne in an event known as the Glorious Revolution. Largely bloodless in England, the king was exiled to France, and so, making his way southeast out of London, bound for the Channel, he stayed overnight in Rochester's Abdication House, before leaving the country he once reigned for the very last time. In all truth, he was more of a semi-prisoner at the house, less a guest in the vein of Princess Victoria and Charles Dickens on their visits to Rochester's high street hotels. And speaking of which, just here we find another local hotel, the Gordon, a beautiful 17th century inn that also once hosted many of the people journeying along this road across Kent. It stands just a couple of doors down the street from another notable high street landmark, a building which hosts one of Rochester's most distinctive museums. Inside this address you'll find the Huguenot Museum, the very first in Britain dedicated to Huguenot history. Now, the Huguenots were Protestant refugees who came to England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, fleeing religious persecution in France. As many as 50,000 of them made their way over the Channel, and they established new lives in many different places across Britain. But Kent, as the first place many people reached, was the biggest recipient of Huguenot refugees. And the Huguenots were people who brought with them new skills and businesses that helped to reshape and modernise domestic industry. Now, we'll talk more about the Huguenots in a moment or two, but beside their museum is another eye-catching building. This is known as the Six Poor Travellers' House, and very simply, it was a charitable institution which provided food and lodging for up to 6 poor travellers passing through Rochester. Established back in 1579 by the local MP Richard Watts, it actually remained in operation right up until the Second World War, and today the building hosts a museum of its own. Evidently, there's something in the water in this part of the high street, because just here we find the site of another famous charitable institution. Affectionately known as La Providence, this is the site of the French Hospital, an institution which can trace its history all the way back to the year 1718, when it was founded to improve the welfare of Huguenots who'd come to England and their descendants. Now, this isn't actually the original French hospital. It was first located in Finsbury, in London, and later Hackney. But in 1959, the institution came here to Rochester. The flats that we see converted into almshouses, which to this day provide accommodation and care to those in distress. The houses here were once known as Theobald Square, but the doctor's house took on the French name of La Providence as a symbol of the institution's enduring duty to care. And indeed, speaking of names, we haven't delved into the story behind this town's name. As we know, the Romans called this place Durobrivae, a name which is often believed to mean the fort by the bridge. But how did Durobrivae become Rochester? Well, it appears that upon Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, people began pronouncing this old Roman name as Robrivis, and they added a suffix, caster, denoting that this was a fortified Roman town. So this place came to be known as Robriviscaster, and over a period of centuries, and through a process of classically long-winded changes in language, the name was corrupted into Hroffiscaster, Rovcester, and eventually Rochester. But while the name may have changed, many other things about this place haven't. The City Wall pub here points us towards the historic fortifications, which we'll take a look at in a few moments' time. But Rochester, with its storied cathedral, stunningly preserved castle keep, wide array of captivating high street inns and other landmarks, and indeed its famous association with Charles Dickens, is a real treasure trove of history. Rochester may have lost its title as a city, the only one in British history to ever do so. But that's nothing to be ashamed about. Perhaps it's just the latest twist in the ever-enthralling tale of this town, a place that surely ranks as one of the most riveting in all of Kent. And we've not even seen it all yet, because just up ahead of us here on the left, there stands a rather grand building, and one filled with yet more stories. Known as Eastgate House, the building was completed in the 1590s as an Elizabethan-era townhouse for the local mayor, one Sir Peter Buck, whose family lived here for generations to come. After 200 years as a family home, however, Eastgate House was converted into a local school at some time around the turn of the 19th century, and it was later repurposed as a Victorian boarding school for girls. But perhaps the house is most famous because of none other than Mr. Dickens. The author, ever the admirer of Rochester's High Street, used Eastgate House in 2 of his novels, and not just any 2, his very first and his very last. Eastgate House stars as the craftily renamed Westgate in the Pickwick Papers, written by Dickens in 1836, and then he used it once again as a school for young ladies called The Nun's House in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which as we know was written shortly before his death in 1870. It's a majestic landmark that brings an end to our walk along the High Street. But we're not entirely finished yet, because we can't leave Rochester without paying a visit to the old city walls. Here we are then, just a short distance from the High Street, admiring the northeast tower of the old city walls. These aren't the original Roman fortifications, rather a substantial rebuild that dates from the 13th and 14th centuries, when conflict up at the castle was at its peak. And so they clearly showcase the significance that this city held, needing to be fiercely protected on all sides. But sadly, it is indeed here beside the city walls that our walk around Rochester has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to making your own visit to the historic former city of Rochester sometime soon.